In this episode of the Encounter Report, three men of the sea look for salvage in Xenogears. There's Axelrod, your humble narrator, who did a blind playthrough on the PlayStation 3. Crayson, our marathon runner, who did a Second Plus playthrough on an emulator. And Super Derek, who did a blind playthrough on the PlayStation 3. And with that out of the way, the open sea awaits. Battle types are up first, and we have some fairly large variances in the times. There's a pretty big gap between Super Derek and Crayson in random encounters, but everyone's boss times are extremely close together. There's also some distance in playtime across all of us that doesn't exactly translate one-to-one. Additionally, it's interesting that Crayson's random encounter count is not that far off from myself, yet equates to over 2 hours, especially when you compare that to Super Derek, where I'm over 4 hours behind. The total death percent also shows a brief story here on where all the deaths occurred. Xenogears has a lot of fights that need to be done in order to progress the main story, but which ones are boss encounters and which ones are story encounters? This got so confusing that I even consulted the Xenogears strategy guide in hopes of gaining better understanding, but that basically labels every fight a boss fight, so something to keep in mind for later since I took some liberties here. Battle locations are up next, and we can immediately see that dungeons are the main focus here. They took a minimum of 19% of the total VOD time and go into double-digit hours for all of us. In general, world map traversal is pretty tame since the world map is relatively small and you don't get a ton of opportunities to visit it for new discoveries. Following that up are combat types where we can see how battles concluded. Each of us had our fair share of deaths on the bosses you'd expect, such as Miang's Gear with High Shao, Shakan, Deus, and Opiomorph. We also managed to get double-digit encounter percentages on the encounters ran from. Of those, I failed to run 70 times with a 69 run fail percent, while Crayson was at 93 failed run attempts and a 48 run fail percent, and Super Derek at 89 failed run attempts with a 49 run fail percent. For the issue encounters, I basically cut footage of the Deus fight until it halved its hit points far enough for me to kill it, and Crayson's were game resets in the middle of an encounter. For subtypes, we can briefly see some of the extra stuff or classifications tracked here. Everyone partook in some grinding, where I primarily did it to get magnetic coats for my gears. Crayson did it for levels and grinding death blows, and Super Derek wanted some speed shoes. I also tracked what battles we were in gears for the fun of it and was pretty surprised to see such a high percentage. At minimum, 44% of all encounters were gear fights, and those fights took a minimum of 50% of the total encounter time. We've also got the level progression graph for each person. On the left, we have the levels, and on the bottom, many of the enemies I classified as bosses in the game. Each boss takes up a rectangle in the graph, and within those rectangles, we have phase levels for each participant when that boss was defeated. Here we can see that we largely stay within a few levels of each other until the physics fight, where Super Derek generates a lead of 4 levels. They start to even out a bit again after that, but Super Derek maintains a lead for every boss, and Crayson's levels start to fall behind, starting with the bloody fight. I try to stay competitive where I can, but still fall behind Super Derek the whole way through. Next up is the boss encounter time graph. On the left, we have the time, and on the bottom, each enemy I classified as a boss in the game. Each boss takes up a rectangle, and within those rectangles, the length of time it took each person to defeat the boss on their latest kill attempt. Here we can see that the time taken to defeat bosses can vary quite a bit, but for the most part, Crayson and Super Derek have similar times. I have multiple spikes, but manage to be competitive here and there. Crayson sports some of the quickest times on this set, some of which are fairly large gaps as well. For the next set of bosses, Crayson once again keeps his times pretty low. The Shakan fight in particular proved to be a challenging one for each of us, but Crayson caught on pretty quickly on what needed to be done. In general, it seemed like Crayson excelled in gear fights while Super Derek and myself had easier time on the on-foot battles. And for the last set of bosses, our time started to decrease again. Crayson decided to fight Deus, having only killed Metatron and Sundel, which resulted in a long drawn-out battle. I killed all the optional bosses before fighting Deus, and Super Derek killed none of them and managed to get the quickest time out of it as well. Microscopes at the ready because it's time for party composition with the last scene levels. Each character that was in our final party has a faint gray highlight to them, although for Crayson it's a little more nebulous. He beat the final Deus fight with Emeralda rather than Billy, while going through the final dungeon with Bart. He also spent a lot of time with Ellie in the party, of which Super Derek also did, but had Billy in for a solid chunk too. Tough to say who Crayson's final party is or should have been. A constant in everyone's team was Satan, though. Without a doubt the strongest of the characters, who only gets better as the game goes on. And then there's Choo Choo, who everyone tried out for a small period of time and had enough of our stuffed animal friend. Following that are combat actions, where each character's death blows were tracked and are briefly going to cycle by. And something you see here on Faye that is consistent is the range and amounts of death blows used. All of us were trying to get as many death blows learned as possible, so we spent less time using them and more time inputting various commands. Ellie doesn't find herself in battles for very long, making her death blows pretty tough to learn naturally. Super Derek found himself using Ellie quite a bit, but since her speed was so low, she often lost out to Satan and Faye killing enemies before she even got a turn. Satan was a constant factor in everyone's party, and we can see the death blows used here as a pretty big indicator of that. For myself, Renkin was my go-to, while Krayson used Shinrai, and Super Derek Jinrai. Krayson also didn't use any of the elemental death blows here prior to getting the sword. And speaking of sword, Satan also has access to a completely new set of death blows after acquiring it. Crystal Water was a consistent use for both Super Derek and myself, while Krayson saw Festive Wind used 3 times. It's also worth noting that on bosses, Krayson almost exclusively used the combo system, which wasn't tracked, and Super Derek used it quite a bit on bosses as well. For Bart and the remaining characters, usage of death blows diminish at a rapid pace. This is largely due to them not making the final cut, or being in gear battles instead of on foot battles. Characters like Rico rarely made the cut while he wasn't required to be in the party, whereas Billy was used a decent amount by all of us, but didn't get much death blow usage. And lastly, Emeralda joins the party very late into the game, and by that point, gear battles are the bulk. For this encounter report, I did not track gear death blows because it wouldn't display the inputs for non-death blow actions. The reasons for this is I also tracked each character's inputs in battles. Here we can see each time a character used triangle, square, and the cross or X button in non-gear battles. Since you can use up to 7 triangles in a battle, it was very easy to rack up hundreds and even thousands of them. Cross was utilized the least due to its maximum of 2 inputs, and square just above that at 3 inputs per turn. Chapter data is next, and it wasn't too easy to get an idea of how chapters worked in Xenogears, so I opted to go with disc separation here. And that split causes Disc 1 to bear the most brunt of encounters, although Disc 2 has a very long amount of time spent in encounters. We can also see the total death percent, indicating that Disc 2 is no slouch on its tough battles either. The number of enemies will briefly stop on by to show one of the more narrow spreads of fights. It doesn't happen often where 1 and 2 enemy encounters make up the largest count, and 3 and 4 enemy encounters aren't that far off. This is also a rare game where it goes higher than 5 enemies in a fight, but none of us saw a 7 enemy encounter. And to wrap everything up, here are the final combined stats. Both Krayson and myself have the same average encounter time and average enemies per fight, yet are more than 12 hours apart in VOD time. Meanwhile, Super Derek crushes us both with 758 encounters and 76 hours played. And yet, we are all within 3% of each other for encounter percent despite the large discrepancy in VOD time. And that's the Xenogears Encounter Report. I hope you visit everyone's channels and social media to praise them for all this wonderful data. With another report done, I heard there's a card game for Men of the Sea. Anyone interested in playing? Thanks for watching, appreciate it, see you on the next video.